What's up guys, Fire here, and today we'll be doing a rundown and analysis of the champion changes in patch 4.5. Now I've revamped this format from last time, so on screen you're going to see the overview of what they've changed, and then we'll talk about what impact it's going to have. Hopefully it should be way more interesting to watch than just staring at patch notes with me talking over it. So we'll start with the two reworks that came in this patch for Rengar and Gregor. Now Rengar has always been in this odd place really, where he either carries insanely hard or he just feeds, and he's just a really risky pick, which is what they've tried to change. So let's look at the new abilities first of all. So his Q has a reduced cooldown but also reduced damage, and it doesn't grant attack speed anymore. So to balance this out, now only the empowered Q has the attack speed bonus, but it also grants some bonus AD on top of that. His W received pretty similar treatment and has a reduced cooldown, but it grants less stats. Now they've balanced that part out with an increased duration, and interestingly it now grants a 50% bonus per champion hit, which is pretty huge for team fighting. Now his E has turned into more of a chasing tool than a poking tool, which is good mid game but means his lane phase is hit pretty hard. Finally, his ult received a few tweaks, which you can see on screen now. Now these changes overall really mean that you have to build damage to do damage, and that a glass cannon build is going to hurt so much more because of the bonus 10% AD on his empowered Q. So in a way, Tank Rengar has survived the rework as well. It'll just kind of mean that you won't really be doing much damage at all anymore. The W makes you pretty tanky even when you're building damage, but when you combine that with a bunch of defensive items, you're going to be really hard to kill. Now the main problem is that, for me, in a hard matchup, he can't really max his E anymore to harass because it's a skill shot and the enemy is just going to stand behind minions. Now there were a lot of ultimate changes here, but in short it basically means that you are primarily going to be an engagement tool now, and it's worse for running away or escaping ganks. Now a lot of people have mentioned the 1000 range alert for enemies and it's just unnecessary, but in my opinion it's not really as huge for solo queue as it's going to be for competitive play, as people aren't coordinated enough to react to it anyway. So the second rework was to Gregor, and this was a lot more of a change I think than Rengar's changes. Now the reason it's such a big change is because he's gone from more of a pure mage to a tank. And don't get me wrong, I mean you can still play him as AP and you'll probably win games, but I'd argue that he's strongest as an AP bruiser now. So let's just cover the new skill set that he has. His passive is now going to heal 4% of his max health instantly, which is pretty cool, but it now has an 8-second cooldown, so you can't spam spells to heal anymore. Now his barrel or Q had its attack speed debuff replaced with a movement speed slow instead, and it has this unique mechanic now where it does more damage the longer time you leave it before exploding. Now it also has a lower range, lower damage, lower AP ratio, but a lower mana cost as well. His W is the only thing that's been completely reworked though. So the cooldown is a ton lower, and your next basic attack will now do bonus damage, much like how Jax's W works. You can use it while you move now, but you'll be moving slightly slower, and they have removed the mana gain and the AD buff, so he's going to have a few mana problems in the lane phase as well. So his E was probably the second most changed thing about Gregor, because they've removed the AD ratio. It does slightly more damage, but it now has a 1-second stun or knockback, which seems like it'll be really good for catching people out. Finally, his ultimate is pretty much the same, it just does less damage. Now it feels like with all these changes that Gregor has really become more of a top lane bruiser than a mage. Now, we've already seen Gregor's top lane in the LCS and in solo queue, and it's been doing pretty well, and sometimes they build a little bit more tanky, so like a Rod of Ages, and these changes really lend themselves to that playstyle. Now I mean he still does decent damage, but it's not really burst damage anymore, which is kind of the job of an AP right now, and if you want to effectively harass your opponent as a mage, you'd need to leave that barrel there for a while, and I really doubt anyone is going to wander into that big ass red barrel that is about to explode. His W combined with his E seems pretty strong though, because you slam into someone, knock them back slightly and hit them with your empowered auto, which is why I think playing him a bit more tanky would be really viable. Now Fox will also be happy too, as they didn't kill Jungle Gregor with these changes, so he's definitely still viable and maybe even slightly better with the empowered auto attack. Okay, so let's move on to the champion changes then. So these haven't been reworked, they've just been buffed or nerfed. Now, first one up is Graves, and this is the first buff he's ever got since his release. He's always been nerfed previously, and as a Graves main, I absolutely love that he's getting some attention. These aren't really going to make him a really popular pick, but it will make him slightly better. I mean, he's already pretty good at trading with people like Lucian, who are in the meta right now, and these changes will make it just a little bit easier. So his quick draw mana cost is now down and his ultimate damage is up, which basically means that his ult will have more burst potential, which is great, and you can use the quick draw a little bit more in lane and not have to worry about going out of mana. So next up we have Heimerdinger, and they're going to reduce his turret damage, which is probably a pretty deserved nerf because at the moment he's really strong in lane. His biggest strength at the moment, in solo queue at least, is that he pushes the person into the turret, that he makes them miss CS under turret, and if they go aggressive or the jungler ganks, he put down his ultimate turret and he just kills them both. These changes are going to go some way to fixing that, and they're going to make it more of a siege tool rather than a burst tool. So moving on to Kha'Zix then, and Kha'Zix is in a really strong place right now, and in my opinion he is pretty much pick or ban, and the biggest reason for that is his ultimate. How his ultimate works at the moment obviously means you get 2 seconds stealth, but the 50% damage reduction means that it practically doubles health and shields. It means that not only does Kha'Zix do a ton of damage, but he also doesn't take much in return either. Now these changes go a little way to fixing that, but they don't really address the problem. Right now they're making it a little bit harder to kind of duke around with your stealth with that second delay in between, allowing people to CC you and lock you up and kill you, but it doesn't really fix why he's so strong right now. Now these Lee Sin changes are actually pretty heavy-handed and they're going to affect him in quite a few different ways. So early game it's going to be harder for him to invade because the 14-second cooldown now means that he probably wants to use a W to take less damage on a camp that he's stealing, but then it's not going to be ready for him to escape with. Now late game as well, when you insect someone, you're insecting to a ward, so it means that you're going to get the full cooldown and you're probably not going to be able to escape, which means that really you just trade kills with people unless you flash out. It's not completely destroyed him or anything like that. I mean, if you watch the CLG versus TSM game last week in the LCS, then you see Dexter actually safeguarded to his AD and always kicked the diver off of him straight away. So that's kind of the playstyle they're moving him to. This Leona nerf is pretty simple. They're just making her less tanky in lane, and they're also giving her less health regeneration. So it means that if she has a bad trade, she's not going to regen straight away. This is probably warranted because she is so strong in lane at the moment, and as soon as she gets a couple of items, and especially with the face of the mountain rush that people are going for on her now, it makes her very hard to kill. So let's just move on to Lulu, and at first glance it doesn't look as bad as it actually is because they're really targeting the mid lane Lulu. Now before you could put health picks on the enemy which did a bunch of burst damage anyway, but then you can get 2 glitter lances off in the duration. Now they've reduced the follow duration to 4 seconds instead of 6. It means that you can only get 1 glitter lance off on the enemy instead of 2, and it actually reduces the amount of pokes you can do by quite a lot. I don't think it's going to be the end to the mid lane Lulu or anything like that, but I do think that it's going to reduce her early potential to kill someone. Now this misfortune change is almost like a rework. They've really tweaked how it actually works. Her Q now does more damage and has a lower mana cost, and the lower mana cost is the really important part here. Before she used to run out of mana before she really did any kind of meaningful damage, but now especially early, you can poke pretty heavily and actually still have mana to fight. Now the other 2 big changes apart from her Q are to her W and her R, her bullet time. So her ultimate is now less about the wombo combo that it kind of used to be associated with and more about fighting afterwards as well. Now the reason for this is because it applies the impure shots, which means that every auto attack you then put on the enemy after they've sat through bullet time, you'll do increased damage to them. It's going to be really good if a team is running at you, you then use your ultimate and your team re-engages, and then you can clean up the fight when they have these impure shot stacks onto them. Now the reason I put buff in question mark with Renekton is because I'm not sure whether it's a buff or a nerf. I mean, they're nerfing his early game, but they're buffing his late game, which is kind of where he falls off. Now early, the biggest nerf is going to be the 200 health instead of 300. That's going to be obviously a 30% decrease, so that's actually pretty huge. Now, the reason I actually think it's a buff late game is because he gets an extra 200 health at rank 3, and he also gets an extra 20 damage per tick, which means that in a big AoE persistent team fight, he's going to deal out a lot of damage. This Twisted Fate change isn't really going to affect much because they buffed him in one area but kind of nerfed it in the other. So now you have less time to select a card, but you have more time to use it. The reason they're doing this is so that you can pick that card when you're porting to another lane and you have longer to throw it before it disappears. I think it's a move in the right direction, but it's not going to make him return to proper play. Now these Wukong changes I actually really like because he's very strong early, and a big part of that is because a lot of champions don't have much armor, and he shredded way too much of that armor early. Now they've moved the armor shred lower at early ranks and the same in the end game, so it means that by the time the big team fights come around at the end, they haven't nerfed his damage too much apart from on his ultimate. His ultimate did a little bit too much damage in an AoE area anyway, and so I don't think these changes are going to take him out of the meta at all. I actually think this has kind of balanced him out. So that wraps up my rundown for patch 4.5, and I really do hope you enjoyed the new format. I put a lot of work into making sure it looked really good, but let me know if you prefer it this way or if you prefer it where I did it before, where I just show you the patch notes and talk over it. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure you subscribe to both me and my brother Foxtrot. Both the links will be down below, and I'll catch you in my next video.